The first thing Daniel Voss did every morning was check on the wounded. Not the colonists. Not the livestock pens at the East Dome. He checked the perimeter fence line first, walking it slowly in the gray light before anyone else was awake, his eyes scanning the edge of the dark forest beyond the wall. Most people in Outpost Re thought he did it out of habit. They were wrong. He did it because something out there always needed help, and Daniel had decided a long time ago that need did not care about species. Outpost Re sat on the edge of a wide clearing on the planet Vera, a world the Interstellar Survey Registry had flagged in red letters for 3 separate reasons. Aggressive megafauna, toxic spore cycles, violent seasonal storms the colonists called the Black Wind. The planet was beautiful in a cold, sharp way tall silver trees with bark like polished stone, soil that smelled of iron and rain, skies that turned deep violet at dusk. Beautiful, and completely willing to kill anything that lowered its guard. The colony had been there for 11 years. 18 structures, 2 agricultural domes, 1 clinic, 1 communications tower, and a perimeter wall made of reinforced alloy panels that hummed faintly with an electrostatic charge. The wall kept most things out. Most things. Daniel was 39 years old, lean and quiet, with the kind of steady hands that come from years of work that cannot afford a mistake. He had come to Vera as the colony's only veterinarian, a job that on most settled worlds meant treating domestic animals and the occasional work beast. On Vera, it had turned into something stranger. It started 3 years after the colony arrived. A creature had been found near the eastern fence, enormous and broken, its left flank torn open by what the security team identified as a rival's attack. The creature was of Rel. Even lying on its side, bleeding and still, it was terrifying. 6 limbs, used for movement, and 2 held closer to the chest like arms. A broad skull with 4 amber eyes that tracked everything in the room. Fur the color of dark slate that stood slightly on end when it breathed, each strand ending in a tiny rigid tip. The Colony Council's first vote was to put it down. Too dangerous to treat, they said. Too close to the wall. If they helped it and it recovered, it would simply become a threat they had strengthened. Daniel did not agree. He said so, politely and clearly, and when the council voted him down, he went back to the council room the next morning and said it again. He had been studying the Vrel for 2 years by then. He had watched them from the observation tower, cataloged their behaviors, noticed the patterns in their movement. They were not random. They were intelligent in a way that the colony had not bothered to measure yet, because measuring it took patience, and patience was not the colony's strongest skill. He told the council that killing of Vrel Alpha would not make the colony safer. He told them it would do the opposite. They did not listen. But Owen Pratt, the security chief, gave Daniel one night to prove his point before the morning team came to deal with the creature. Owen did not say it as a kindness. He said it because he thought Daniel would fail and the argument would finally be settled. Daniel spent that night working. He sedated the Vrel carefully, cleaned the wound, repaired the tissue damage, and used a compound he had been quietly developing from Varan plant extracts to reduce the infection that had already started in the torn muscle. He worked without sleep. When the morning team arrived, the Vrel was breathing evenly, its wound closed and dressed. It was alive. Owen had stood at the door of the clinic looking at the creature for a long time without saying anything. 2 days later, the Vrel was strong enough to walk. Daniel opened the side gate and let it go. He stood at the fence as it moved into the tree line and disappeared. He did not expect anything from it. He had helped it because it was in pain and he knew how to reduce pain. That was the whole of his thinking at the time. The Vrel came back the following week. Not to attack. It stood at the fence line for almost an hour, watching the clinic, then left. It came back the week after that. And the week after that, Daniel started leaving the gate cracked open on the mornings it appeared. Over months, it began to enter the outer yard. He named it Kesh, privately, not because he thought it understood names, but because he needed something to call it in his notes. The colony thought he was reckless. Some of them were afraid of him in the indirect way people are afraid of someone who does not share their fear. Owen watched him with the careful attention of a man waiting for something to go wrong. Nothing went wrong. Kesh never harmed anyone in the outer yard. It ate the meat Daniel left and watched him work. And sometimes it was still there when Daniel's son came out in the morning to find his father. Milo was 8 years old and looked exactly like Daniel at that age, which Daniel knew from old photographs. Same narrow shoulders, same habit of tilting his head when he was thinking, same tendency to move slowly around animals, because somewhere in his nature, he already understood that stillness was a form of kindness. Milo had grown up watching his father treat livestock and wild creatures with the same careful attention, and it had shaped him in ways Daniel was only beginning to see. Milo called the Vrel the Big Gray One, because Daniel had never told him its name. He was not afraid of it. He had asked his father once if it was safe, and Daniel had said, honestly, that nothing on Vera was completely safe, but that this one had chosen something different. Milo had thought about that for a moment and then nodded, as if it made perfect sense to him. It made sense to Daniel too. It was the only thing, in 11 years on a Deathworld, that did. What neither of them knew yet was that Kesh had not simply chosen to trust one quiet human veterinarian. In the logic of the Vrel pack, it had done something far more binding than that. It had marked Daniel's scent as kin, and in Vrel territory, what was marked as kin was defended. That rule was about to matter more than Daniel had ever imagined. The creature in the fence was small and frightened, and Milo saw it from his bedroom window before anyone else was awake. He had been lying on his back watching the ceiling, which was what he did on mornings when sleep left him too early and his thoughts moved too fast. His window faced the eastern perimeter, and the morning light outside was still pale and thin, the sky just beginning to shift from black to the deep violet that came before sunrise on Vera. He almost missed it. A small shape pressed against the outer fence panel, low to the ground, tangled in the wire that ran between the lower sensor posts. It was one of the native creatures his father called a thresh. Small and furred, about the size of a rabbit, with wide flat ears and legs built for speed. This one was not running anywhere. Its back leg was caught in a gap in the sensor wire, and it was pulling against it weakly, the way animals do when they have been pulling for a long time and are almost out of strength. Milo got dressed without turning on the light. He knew the rule. Everyone in Outpost Re knew the rule. The perimeter gate did not open until full light, and no one, not even adults, went outside the wall without 2 other people and a security clearance logged with Owen Pratt's office. The rule existed because Vera was not careful about what it killed. It did not sort by age or size or intention. The forest took what it could reach. Milo knew the rule. He went out anyway. He did not go through the gate. He had found the maintenance gap 6 months ago, a section of the lower panel near the southeast corner where the ground had shifted and the base of the wall had lifted just enough for a small person to slide under if they went flat. He had never told anyone about it. He had not planned to use it for anything dangerous. He had used it twice before to watch a nest of ground-dwelling birds that lived just outside the wall, because they only came out at dawn and the fence blocked his view from inside. Both times he had slid back under before anyone noticed he was gone. This felt different, but his mind had already decided before his body caught up with the reasoning. The thresh was going to tear its own leg off if it kept pulling. He had seen that happen to animals in snares before. His father had shown him, gently and honestly, because he believed Milo should understand how things suffered if he was going to one day work with living creatures the way Daniel did. He slid under the panel, got to his feet, and moved to the outer fence in a low crouch the way his father moved around nervous animals. The thresh heard him coming and froze, which was the right response from its point of view. Milo stopped moving too. He waited. He counted to 30 in his head. Then he moved again, slower this time, not looking directly at it, keeping his hands loose at his sides. The leg was caught in a simple loop of wire. He could see exactly how to free it. He worked his fingers into the gap carefully, feeling the wire resist, and then shifted the angle just slightly until the pressure released. The thresh pulled free, scrambled to its feet, stood for 1 second looking at him with its wide amber eyes, and bolted for the tree line. Milo stood up and felt pleased with himself. He also noticed, in that same moment, that the sky had changed. The violet had gone dark again, not the dark of night, but a different dark, heavier and moving. The black wind. He had seen it come in from the observation tower before, had watched it swallow the sky in less than 15 minutes on the days it arrived early. His father had told him it moved faster when the temperature dropped in the upper atmosphere. His father had also told him that no one with sense was outside the wall when the black wind came down. He turned and ran back toward the maintenance gap. The alarm reached him before he did. A low, repeating tone from the colony's weather system, which automatically triggered a perimeter lockdown when a Blackwind signature appeared on the sensors. He heard the heavy magnetic locks engage in sequence along the wall panels, a sound like a row of fists hitting metal, moving from north to south around the perimeter. He heard the gate motors run through their closing cycle. He got to the panel and pushed himself flat and tried to slide under. The ground sensor that ran beneath the gap was now active. Part of the lockdown protocol, his father had explained once. The low current through the base wire was meant to stop burrowing creatures from getting under the wall during a storm. It was not enough to seriously hurt a person, but it was enough to make every muscle in his body snap tight at once, and he pulled back from it with a short, sharp cry. He sat against the outside of the wall with his back pressed to the alloy panel and the Blackwind coming down over the treetops, and tried to think. Inside the colony, the alarm was pulling people out of their beds. Daniel woke to the lockdown tone and reached for Milo's room door out of pure habit and found the room empty. He stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds, looking at the made bed and the window and the direction the window faced. Then he was running. Owen Pratt met him at the security station already in his jacket, already reading the weather panel. He looked up when Daniel came in and started talking before Daniel could say anything. Blackwind is going to hit in 8 minutes. Sensors are clear. Everyone's accounted for at muster. He paused, reading Daniel's face. What? Daniel said one word. Milo. Owen looked at the muster board. One light was not showing green. Outside, past the locked wall and the humming wire and the rising wind, a boy of 8 sat in the dark against the metal and listened to the forest wake up around him. Rain arrived before the wind did. Not the gentle kind. Varan rain in a Blackwind cycle came in hard and sideways, each drop carrying the faint chemical edge that came from moisture pulled through the upper spore layer of the atmosphere. It was not toxic at low exposure, but it stung bare skin and turned the ground slippery within minutes. By the time Owen Pratt had confirmed Milo's absence and Daniel was standing in the security station with wet boots and a cold face, the perimeter lights were already cutting through a wall of gray water and the tree line was invisible. The Colony Council met in the corridor outside the security room because there was no time for the formal meeting hall. For people, still pulling on jackets, voices tight. We cannot open the gate during a lockdown, said Ren, the colony's structural engineer, who also served as the council's safety officer by default because no one else had wanted the role. She was not being cruel. She was reading from the protocol document in her head, the one that she had helped write. A Blackwind lockdown requires all personnel inside the perimeter. Manual override needs a unanimous council vote. Then vote, Daniel said. Daniel. That was Owen, who had moved to stand beside him. His voice was lower than usual, which was the version of Owen's voice that meant he was being honest rather than official. If I send people out there in this, I am putting lives at risk that I am responsible for. You understand that. You know I'm not saying no to be difficult. I know, Daniel said. I'm not asking you to send anyone. I'm asking the council to let me go. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. You will die, said Ren flatly. Probably not, said Daniel. He said it without arrogance. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, and after having thought about it, which made it harder to dismiss than if he had shouted it. He had spent 3 years learning how the Vrel moved at night, what sounds they made when they were hunting versus when they were moving territory, what smells triggered aggression, and what smells signaled non-threat. He knew where the open ground ran between the densest tree cover. He knew the Blackwind would reduce visibility for every living thing in the forest equally, which meant the predators that hunted by sight would be moving slowly too. He also knew that Milo was wearing one of his old field jackets, the one Daniel had worn for 2 years of perimeter work, of feeding Kesh, of sitting in the outer yard with a creature that had learned to tolerate his smell. The jacket had been too big for the boy, but Milo had wanted it anyway, in the way children want specific worn things that carry the presence of a person they love. Daniel had let him have it without thinking much about it. He was thinking about it now. Owen studied him for a long moment. Then he walked to the override panel, pressed his clearance code, and turned to the other council members. Not asking. His expression was asking on Daniel's behalf, which was as much as Owen was willing to do. Ren voted yes. So did the other two. Reluctantly, carefully, with the faces of people who were already deciding how they would feel afterward. Owen handed Daniel a radio, a light pack, a charged flare gun, and a thermal layer. He did not say good luck. He said, 2-hour check-ins. If you miss 2 in a row, I'm opening the gate and coming in myself. He said it like a threat, which was how Owen delivered things he meant sincerely. Daniel nodded, turned up the thermal layer's collar, and walked to the gate. There was a young colonist named Sarah standing near the gate controls, one of the agricultural techs who had no reason to be in the security area at this hour. She was holding a wrapped parcel of high-density ration bars and a second torch. She held them out to Daniel without speaking, and her face was doing the thing faces do when someone has decided not to say what they are feeling. Daniel took the supplies, touched her shoulder once, and stepped through the gate. The black wind hit him like a flat hand. The sound was immense. Whine through the silver trees produced a deep, resonant tone that was almost musical at a distance and was completely overwhelming up close, layered over the hiss of the rain and the creak and knock of branches. The perimeter lights behind him dimmed almost immediately as the rain thickened. He clicked on his torch, put his head down, and moved east along the outer wall to the maintenance gap, because that was where Milo would have gone out. He found the boy's tracks in the soft ground. Small boot prints, already filling with water, leading away from the wall toward the fence sensor posts and then east toward the tree line. A second set overlapped the first heading back, which meant Milo had been running when he came back, which meant he had known the storm was coming, which meant the gap had been locked down before the boy reached it. Daniel stood for a moment with his eyes closed and his torch aimed at the ground, calculating. The tracks continued east into the trees, not by choice, he thought, but because the wall curved in that direction and Milo would have followed it looking for another way in. East was also the side of the perimeter closest to the Vrel's known territory boundary. He moved into the trees. The forest closed behind him quickly and completely, the way forests do on worlds that have been growing for longer than anyone has been watching them. He moved carefully, watching his footing, keeping the wall's faint hum to his left as an orientation point. The radio crackled once, and Owen's voice came through. Just a test ping, confirming connection. Daniel clicked back twice. Somewhere ahead of him, past the rain and the dark and the deep sound of the black wind, Milo was out there. And if Daniel's understanding of Vrel territory was correct, so was Kesh. Milo had stopped running 20 minutes ago. Running in the dark forest had lasted until his boot caught a root and put him face first into the wet ground. And he lay there for a moment with his cheek against the cold soil and made himself breathe slowly, the way his father had taught him. Breathe first. Panic after, if you still need to. Milo had never fully understood that instruction until now, because as he lay still on the ground and made himself breathe, the panic slowly lost some of its sharpness, and he found that he could think again. He had moved along the wall looking for another way back in. There was no other way in. The lockdown had sealed every panel, and the base current was running the full length of the perimeter. He could hear its faint hum even above the rain. He had tried twice more to find gaps, and felt the current both times through his boot soles. He had cried a little, which he was not embarrassed about, because he was 8 and he was alone in the dark on a death world, and his father was not here. Then he had found the hollow at the base of a large stone-bark tree where the roots formed a half-wall against the wind, and he crawled into it, wrapped his father's jacket tightly around himself, and thought. He knew the black wind would pass. Storms on Vero were violent, but not long. His father had said they usually burned themselves out in 4 to 6 hours. Milo did not have a way to know what time it was, but the sky had still been dark violet when the storm hit, which meant it was early morning, which meant the storm might be gone by the time full light came. If he stayed still and stayed low and stayed inside the jacket, he could wait it out. He repeated this to himself several times, in the steady inside voice that his father used when he was explaining something difficult. He stayed in the root hollow and listened to the black wind move through the trees above him. That was when he heard something else. Not the wind, something breathing. He went completely still, which his father would have said was the correct response, and which Milo achieved through sheer terror rather than training. He kept his eyes down, not meeting the dark, just watching the ground in front of the root hollow, listening. The breathing was deep and regular. More than one source, coming from multiple directions. Slowly, he turned his head. They were already there. He counted 4 of them before his mind stopped trying to count and simply registered. Vrel. They stood in a loose arrangement around the base of his tree, not packed close, not crouched. Standing. The storm had flattened their fur against their bodies, and the rain ran down their slate-gray coats in thin streams, and their four amber eyes each caught just enough of the faint sky glow to reflect back at him like coins in a dark well. They were not crouched. They were not making the low clicking sound his father said they used when they were deciding about something threatening. They were just standing there. The largest one stood directly ahead, at the edge of the root hollow shelter, close enough that Milo could see the scar tissue along its left side, a wide pale ridge under the fur where something had torn and healed. He knew that scar. He had asked his father about it more than once, had traced its shape from a distance through the outer yard fence with the curiosity of a child who has been told, very clearly, not to touch. He had a name for the creature that carried it, though his father had never given him one. He called it the Big Gray One. The Big Gray One lowered its broad head. It brought its face level with Milo's and breathed in, slowly, once. And then it did something that Milo had never seen Avril do in any of the observation footage his father kept. It pressed the flat side of its jaw, the widest part of its skull, gently against the front of the jacket. Not against Milo. Against the jacket. It held there for several seconds, breathing steadily, and then pulled back. It stood upright again. It turned its head and made a very low sound toward the other Vrel, a short, falling note that was barely audible above the rain. The other three shifted, not closer, but into different positions around the tree. Wider, outward-facing. Milo realized, very slowly, that they were not surrounding him. They were surrounding the tree. They had their backs to him and their faces to the forest, which was not how predators stood around something they considered prey. He sat in the root hollow and watched the Big Gray One settle its weight into a low stance, perfectly still despite the storm, its eyes moving across the dark tree line in long, slow sweeps. Something moved in the deeper forest, large and fast, and the Big Gray One made a different sound, sharp and rising, and the other three pulled in tighter around the tree without being told. Whatever was out there in the dark stopped moving. Milo pressed his back against the root, pulled his knees to his chest inside his father's jacket, and understood something that would take him years to find the right words for. He was not in danger because something out here had decided he was not a threat, or not prey, or not worth the trouble. He was not in danger because something out here had recognized the smell of someone it trusted, and had extended that trust to the small, frightened person wrapped in that person's worn clothing. He was safe because his father had spent 3 years being kind to something that the rest of the colony had wanted to destroy. The black wind howled. The Big Gray One did not move. The others did not move. Milo closed his eyes after a while, not because he was not afraid, but because the rhythm of the breathing around him was steady and even, and the root hollow was sheltered, and he was exhausted in the way only real fear can exhaust a person. He slept, small and still in his father's jacket, while the Vrel kept the dark at bay. Daniel had been in the forest for 2 hours when he found the first sign. He had been moving east and slightly south, following the logic of the terrain more than any clear trail, because the rain had washed Milo's boot prints away within 30 minutes of him leaving the perimeter. He tracked instead by what he knew of his son. Milo would have stayed near the wall as long as he could. Milo would have looked for shelter when running became pointless. Milo would have done what Daniel had told him to do the 6 times they had discussed the emergency protocols together, which was to find a fixed object, stay close to it, and wait. He was also tracking something else. The Vrel left signs that most people never bothered to learn. Ground scrapes, narrow and precise, where the 2 forward limbs dragged slightly when they moved slowly and deliberately. A particular kind of bark disturbance on trees at the boundary of their territory, low down, where they marked with the scent glands on the inner side of their forward limbs. The scrapes he was finding were fresh, barely rained over, and they were not pointing outward the way hunting signs did. They were pointing inward. Something large had moved through this area toward a fixed point and had not come back out. Daniel slowed down and started listening as much as looking. The black wind was still loud, but its pitch had changed, which meant the front edge of the storm had passed over and the back half was moving through. In another hour, maybe 2, it would drop to ordinary wind and then stop. He checked his radio and clicked Owen's frequency twice. Owen clicked back 4 times, the agreed-upon signal for no news, no crisis, still standing by. Daniel kept moving. He was not afraid of the forest in the way the colony was afraid of it. He had spent enough time on the outside of the wall to have separated the forest's many sounds into categories. Sounds that meant an animal was startled. Sounds that meant an animal was hunting. Sounds that meant territory was being defended. He had a rough map of these categories in his head, built from years of patient observation. And as he moved through the trees, he was constantly checking what he heard against the map. The sound that reached him 20 minutes later did not fit any of his categories cleanly. It was a sharp, rising call, short and forceful, the kind of sound that contains an instruction. He had heard Vrel make sounds close to it when they were coordinating during a territory confrontation, but this was cleaner, more directed, like a word rather than a tone. He stopped walking and turned toward it. Then came the second sound, from somewhere beyond the first, low and heavy, and then a sharp crack of something large moving fast through underbrush, followed by silence. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of something having been decided. Daniel moved toward it. He found them by the light of his torch, catching 6 pairs of amber eyes at once, which stopped him so completely that he simply stood still for a long moment and counted. 6 Vrel, 1 alpha, identifiable by size and by the scarred flank. 5 others in a defensive arrangement around a large stone bark tree, outward facing, the rearmost one's back pressed almost to the roots. Daniel lowered his torch slightly, not turning it off, just redirecting the beam to the ground, because he knew from experience that pointing light directly at Vrel's eyes was the one reliable way to produce aggression. He looked for Milo. The boy was in the root hollow, asleep. Daniel could see the rise and fall of his jacket, and he stood in the wet dark with the black wind still moving overhead and felt something shift in his chest that was not quite relief because the situation was not yet resolved, but was close enough to it that his hands stopped shaking. He needed to reach Milo without the pack reacting. He had never approached a Vrel group from the outside during a defensive posture because no one sane had ever tried it. He thought through what he knew, which was considerable but not exhaustive. He thought about what he would do if he were approaching a frightened domestic animal that had accepted him before but was currently in a protective state. He thought about body language, about speed, about smell. He put his torch in his pack and let his eyes adjust. He began moving forward, slowly, not crouching, because crouching was how prey moved when it was hoping not to be noticed. Upright, clear, deliberate, the way he moved in the outer yard when Kesh was present and he wanted the animal to know exactly where he was and what he was doing. He made no attempt to be quiet. He let his footsteps be heard. Kesh turned first. The alpha's 4 eyes found him in the dark. Daniel stopped walking. He stood completely still and let himself be looked at. He did not reach for anything. He kept his hands at his sides, fingers loose, and breathed in a slow and even rhythm, because he had read once, in a paper on Earth's predatory animals, that certain creatures could detect elevated heart rates, and that calm projected outward sometimes produced calm in return. He had since observed that the same seemed to be true of Vrel. The seconds passed. Kesh made a very low sound, not the rising warning call, something quieter. The Vrel immediately behind it turned and looked at Daniel, and then turned back to the forest. The defensive ring shifted, not breaking, but making a gap wide enough for Daniel to walk through. He crossed to the tree in 12 steps and crouched at the root hollow and put his hand on Milo's shoulder. The boy woke immediately, the way children who have been sleeping in fear always do, fully and all at once. He looked at his father's face and then looked at the Vrel surrounding them, and then looked at his father's face again. He did not speak. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Daniel's chest, and Daniel put both arms around him and held on. They stayed like that for a long moment. Around them, the Vrel pack stood in the dark and kept watch, their amber eyes moving slowly across the forest, as steady and reliable as any wall the colony had ever built. Dawn on Vera did not arrive gently. It arrived the way everything on Vera arrived, with full commitment and without warning, the sky going from deep gray to pale violet to a sudden hard gold in the span of 10 minutes, the silver trees catching the light along their bark and throwing it back in long white streaks across the forest floor. The black wind was gone. The rain had stopped an hour before first light, leaving the ground steaming faintly as the temperature rose, and the forest had exhaled slowly and returned to its ordinary sounds. The high calls of canopy birds, the deep rhythmic knock of some burrowing creature far below the roots, the sound of water moving off leaves in small precise falls. Daniel had radioed Owen at first light. He had kept the message short because he was not sure how to explain the situation and had decided that Owen would simply have to see it. Owen arrived 40 minutes later with 6 colonists and 3 of his security team, all of them armed, all of them moving in the tight, cautious formation that Outpost Re used for any excursion outside the perimeter. Daniel heard them coming before he saw them, the way you always heard humans coming in a forest that was not built for human movement. They were not being careless. They were simply unable to be as quiet as the things that lived here. Kesh heard them too. The pack had not moved from their positions around the tree. 2 of them had settled during the last hour of the storm, their legs folded beneath them in the low resting posture Daniel had catalogued many times from the observation tower. But Kesh had not rested. The Alpha had remained in the same standing position through the entire night, its eyes on the forest. When Owen's group came into sight through the trees, the Alpha rose smoothly to full height and faced them. Daniel stood up at the same moment, deliberately placing himself between Kesh and the incoming group. Behind him, Milo was on his feet, holding the jacket closed with both hands and watching everything with serious, careful eyes. Owen stopped the group at the tree line. He looked at Daniel. He looked at the Vrel. He looked at Milo, doing a quick visible check of the boy the way security people check things, head to feet, looking for damage. He found none. Milo was cold and tired and there was mud on his face, but he was standing on his own feet and his eyes were clear. Owen looked at the pack again. He had been on Vera for 8 years. He had seen Vrel from the observation tower and through camera feeds, and once at a distance of about 200 meters during a perimeter incident that he still wrote up in his quarterly report as the most dangerous thing he had experienced in his professional life. He had never seen 6 of them standing in a group around a human child who was asleep and alive. "Hold," he said quietly to his team. His hand went up flat. No one raised a weapon, which was the right call, though Daniel could see that at least 2 of his people wanted to. Daniel turned to face Kesh. He did not use words. Words were for species that had agreed to share a language, and no such agreement existed here. He used what had always worked. He turned to face the Alpha directly, not aggressively, but openly, the way you face something you were willing to be seen by. He let his hands stay open at his sides. He breathed. He held Kesh's gaze for a long moment, for Amber Eye's meeting too, and then he nodded, once, a gesture that meant nothing to the Vrel in any formal sense, but was the only gesture he had for what he was trying to say. "Thank you. I see what you did. I will not forget it." Kesh held his gaze for a long moment. Then the Alpha made the low, falling note that Milo had heard hours ago in the hollow, and turned away. The pack turned with it, smooth and unhurried. No scramble, no retreat. They moved into the trees one by one, and the forest absorbed them. And within 30 seconds there was no sign they had been there except for 6 sets of ground scrapes in the wet soil and the memory of 6 pairs of amber eyes in the dark. Owen Pratt stood very still for a moment. Then he walked forward to where Daniel and Milo were standing, and he crouched in front of the boy and looked at him. "You all right?" he said. Milo said, "The big gray one remembered my dad's jacket." Owen looked up at Daniel over the boy's head. Daniel said nothing. He was watching the tree line. Owen stood up. He cleared his throat, which was a thing he did when he was reorganizing his thinking. He turned to his security team and said, "Pack up and move. Let's get the Voss family home." He did not say anything else. He did not offer an opinion about what he had just seen, or what it meant, or whether it changed anything. But on the walk back through the trees, he moved to fall into step beside Daniel, and after a few minutes of silence he said, without looking at him, "How long have you known they marked you?" "I guessed at it," Daniel said. "About a year ago. I wasn't certain. But you went out there last night partly because of it." "Yes." Owen was quiet again. Then, "That was either the smartest thing I've ever seen someone do or the most reckless." "Probably both," Daniel said. Owen made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "Yeah," he said. "Probably both." They walked the rest of the way in silence. Milo walked between them, one hand in his father's, still wearing the jacket that smelled of 3 years of patience and kindness and quiet work done without an audience. He looked back once at the silver trees, at the place where the pack had vanished, and then faced forward. The colony came into view. The gate was open. Sarah was standing at the edge of it, And when she saw Milo, she pressed one hand over her mouth, and the other went up in a wave. Other colonists had come out to the gate by now, drawn by the radio traffic and the early morning strangeness of an open perimeter. They saw Daniel. They saw Milo. They saw the two of them walk back through the gate, alive and unharmed. Some of them had opinions about Daniel's methods. Some of them had said things about him at colony meetings that Daniel had heard and chosen not to respond to. None of them said any of those things this morning. They stood at the gate in the new gold light and watched him come home. Daniel took Milo to the clinic, checked him over thoroughly, confirmed that he was cold and tired and unhurt, and then sat beside him on the clinic bed while the boy finally, properly, slept. He sat there for a long time. He thought about Kesh standing through the whole of the night. 6 large, powerful creatures with no reason that any survey report or threat assessment would recognize to protect something small and soft and lost in their territory. No reason except a logic that the Interstellar Survey Registry had never bothered to measure, because measuring it took patience, and patience was not everyone's strongest skill. He thought about what that said about the Vrel. He thought about what it said about Vera. He thought about how the colony had been living on this world for 11 years, afraid of it, and armored against it, and how a single act of care had opened a door that no amount of fortification had managed to find. He did not think of himself as remarkable. He was a veterinarian. He helped things that were in pain. It was a simple job, stated simply. What happened after that was simply what sometimes happened when you were consistent and patient and refused to decide in advance that something was not worth understanding. He looked at his sleeping son. He looked at the window, at the silver trees on the edge of the forest, at the world outside the wall that had, last night, kept the most important thing in his life alive. He sat quietly, and he was grateful, and he did not need to explain it to anyone.